Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. In this video, I'm going to be discussing 5 factors that are slowly killing the Jehovah's Witness organization, or as many are increasingly calling it, the Jehovah's Witness cult. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list. There are actually a number of factors that come into play when we think about threats to the organization and its aspirations, but these are the big 5 as far as I'm concerned. They're sort of interrelated as well, as we're going to discuss, but in any case, here we go. Factor number 1, child sexual abuse mishandling. Now, this is becoming a huge thorn in the organization's side. It arguably has been a thorn in the organization's side for at least 20 years now. It was 2002 when there were 2 very damning documentaries aired in the UK and in the United States exposing this issue. And since then, we've just had scandal after scandal, lawsuit after lawsuit, documentary after documentary. This is an issue that isn't going away. The organization faces increasing exposure, including from governments, and that's the crucial issue here. Because to a degree, the organization can just bat off individual cases or individual lawsuits. It can reach settlements depending on how much cash it has available. But when it comes to actual governmental exposure, that's a game changer. And we've seen this in Australia, where they had the Australian Royal Commission in 2015, which has finally resulted in a redress scheme that the organisation has been dragged kicking and screaming into, joining at the 11th hour after they were threatened with having their charitable status removed. This whole situation ultimately proved that money talks. If Watchtower stands to lose considerable funds, in this instance by losing its status as a charity and various tax exemptions, Watchtower is vulnerable and it's willing to make concessions. But otherwise, it's absolutely not willing to make any concessions whatsoever. From what I can see, and I've been watching this situation now over 10 years of activism, the organization considers this a hill worth dying on. They are perfectly willing to stick to policies that endanger children because they consider this a matter of loyalty to Jehovah. They consider their interpretation of Deuteronomy 19 verse 15, the 2-witness rule, they consider that sacrosanct and something that can't be compromised on. And it's this stubbornness that slowly but surely is proving to be the organization's undoing, because it's terrible from a PR perspective. No organization wants to have the reputation of covering up child sexual abuse. That's exactly the reputation the organization has. The media are relentless on this to a degree, even though Jehovah's Witnesses are trained to think of the media as on the case of the organization for every single issue, to the point of being overly critical. In many ways, the media hasn't been covering this enough. And this has been a real problem, because without media exposure, the government isn't under any real pressure to do anything. We've seen this in the United States, where there's very little governmental action compared to countries like Australia and the Netherlands, where the government is stepping in. Expect that to change as we move forward in time. I just can't see future generations tolerating a scenario where an organization is allowed to keep secret records on criminals, on child sexual predators that aren't being handed over to the authorities. It's kind of this open secret that's documented. I mean, you can find proof of this in the organization's own documented policies, that they keep these records and that they don't necessarily hand them on to the authorities. And yet, for whatever reason, Well, actually, I know what the reason is. It's deference to religion. Particularly in the United States, there is an attitude of letting religions do as they please. Even though the United States is in many ways a very secular country, it's still a very religious country, and governmental administrations don't seem to have an appetite for being seen to go after a religious group, perhaps wary of the backlash among the electorate. And I think there's a similar thing going on in the United Kingdom. Again, mostly a secular country, but still very influential religious undercurrents in society, resulting in the government not being as heavy-handed as it ought to be in addressing the issue of the mishandling of child sexual abuse. But this ultimately isn't an issue that's going away. The organization is going to continue to pay a price for its stubbornness to move on this issue. Will it prove to be the ultimate deciding factor in the organization's eventual demise? We'll have to see, because there are other contenders, but certainly the mishandling of child sexual abuse is a very corrosive factor when it comes to looking at the organization's long-term health. Moving on to our second factor, shunning. This is another area where you have a policy that is blatantly going to be unpopular with the wider public, but the organization considers it to be a matter of loyalty, even though it's something they've only been doing since 1952, actually, was when the disfellowshipping policy came into play. And then in 1981, they broadened the policy so that you couldn't disassociate without also being shunned, even though it's a relatively recent teaching in the organization's history. They consider it to be a divine command, something that proves that they are different from the world, separate from the world, more clean and more pure. So they're just not going to move on this, even though it's a narrative that plays straight into the hands of journalists that are covering this organization from a critical perspective, even though it's an area where people like me, where activists can point to the organization as being cruel and unloving and driving people really to the point of suicide in some instances. That's how dangerous this policy is when it comes to people's mental health. Again, they view it as a hill worth dying on. They view it as a matter of loyalty. They're going to cling to it, even if this whole matter of shunning ends up being a factor in the organization's eventual demise. And it could conceivably be, because we've recently seen, of course, the verdict in Belgium, where a criminal court in Ghent ruled against the organization, fining the organization for breaching the country's laws on discrimination. The shunning policy is discriminatory. It breaches and violates people's human rights, because according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, everyone has the right to both follow a religion and join a religion, and also leave or change their religion. So if, as an organization, you are exporting punishment on people who leave your group, you're not respecting their rights to leave. You're not respecting their human rights. And it's interesting that at least in one country, in Belgium, countries are starting to realize that this is not okay. This is actually a violation in terms of discrimination. And it will be interesting to see to what extent, again, governments in other countries start to take note of this practice. We saw in the case of child sexual abuse, what started in Australia is slowly continuing in other countries. It could be that something similar happens with shunning. We will have to wait and see. Moving on to our third factor, and this is one that perhaps you're not expecting me to mention as a factor that could lead to the death of the Jehovah's Witness organization, but I consider JW broadcasting to be detrimental to the aims and aspirations and objectives of the governing body. Why do I say that? Well, when the very first JW Broadcasting episode aired in October 2014, I made a video in which I commented that this was a case of the organization ultimately shooting itself in the foot. They were taking the bait of producing videos and thus showing themselves in a light that perhaps many followers hadn't seen them in before. The more they expose themselves to their followers, the more the governing body risk their followers realizing how ordinary and deluded and uninspiring these individuals who make up the governing body in fact are. And what's interesting is when you look at the actual figures for the publisher numbers for the 6 years before JW Broadcasting and the 6 years after or since JW Broadcasting, it's not looking great for the organization. So in 2008, for the 2008 service year report, there were 6,829,455 average publishers. In 2014, for the 2014 service year report, and bear in mind, this took us to the 1st of September 2014, and the very first JW Broadcasting episode was in October 2014. So these are kind of on the nose in terms of when we would want to divide the 6 years before and 6 years after. The average number of publishers for the 2014 service year report was 7,867,958. So a 15.2% increase. Remember that figure, 15.2% increase between 2008 and 2014, or an increase in actual numbers of 1,038,503. So 2008 to 2014, 15.2% increase. What were the numbers like in the 6 years after JW Broadcasting was introduced? So the numbers for 2020, 6 years after that seminal moment in the organization's history, 8,424,185 average publishers. You will remember that the 2020 service year report was historic because it was the first time in 42 years that there had been an actual decrease in the numbers in the publisher figures from one year to the next. But anyway, here we are. It's still 8 million odd is still more than 7 million odd. So 2020, 8,424,185 average publishers, which is a 7% increase in the 6 years since JW Broadcasting was introduced. Isn't that interesting? So we've gone from 15.2% increase in the 6 years before JW Broadcasting, and half of that, 7% increase in the 6 years following the launch of JW Broadcasting, or an increase in real terms of 556,227. Those are terrible numbers. If you are the governing body and you're looking to JW Broadcasting as a way of turning the trend round, of doing a U-turn, of fighting back against the influence of the internet, fighting back against hemorrhaging publishers because they're waking up, because they're going on Google. If you're looking at JW Broadcasting as a way of countering that, as a way of putting forward your narrative and putting a glossy spin on things, those are not encouraging numbers. You would expect at least to maintain the same level of growth, wouldn't you, between 2014 and 2020? But for your growth to essentially halve to the point where your numbers are stagnating, and again in 2020 we have the first decrease year on year, that does not bode well for the effectiveness of JW broadcasting. And I think what's happening is, well, first of all, fairly obviously, the governing body are addicted to JW broadcasting. It's kind of a drug for them because it gives them an illusion of fame. And let's not forget, these are incredibly vain men. They are conditioned through their role in the organization to think of themselves as being incredibly important. Everywhere they go in the world, they are doted over, they are adored, they are treated as these amazing individuals. Year after year, that's going to have an impact on their own evaluation of themselves. It's going to inflate their ego to no end, to the point where an opportunity to show themselves in front of millions of followers is going to be something that they kind of create a dependency on for their own feeling of self-worth and importance. So they're going to get the figures from the audiovisual services department, or whichever department it is that keeps an eye on the views and on the downloads. And they're going to see that the views and downloads are in the millions. And they're going to think, oh, these are amazing figures. You know, TV shows would kill for these sorts of ratings where millions of people are tuning in. Clearly, we're onto a winning formula here with JW Broadcasting. This is something we should stick to. In fact, this is such a winning formula. Let's build our own Hollywood in Ramapo. Let's not just have our Mount Ebo complex and our various other facilities. Let's get rid of those and have a consolidated facility, just a hop, skip and a jump away from the headquarters, where we can make more of this stuff. Let's do this more. This is wonderful, because look at these figures. They're not thinking for a moment that these views are inevitable when it's literally part of the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses to take in spiritual food, to view or watch or absorb almost anything that's put out from the headquarters, whether it's in written form or whether it's in audio form or whether it's in video form. So there's again this illusion of fame and popularity that is deceiving these men into thinking that JW Broadcasting is having a positive effect on the organization. But the real numbers that they should be looking at are the numbers I've just given, that show that in actual fact, the growth of the organization has slowed dramatically in the 6 years since they launched JW Broadcasting. If they knew what was good for them, they would wrap the whole thing up. Because what they're doing with each and every video that they put out, and it's not just JW Broadcasting, of course, it's also the marathon of videos that get put out during the conventions, the annual meetings, all of that stuff. What's happening when they put out these videos is that they are showing the man behind the curtain. They are destroying the illusion that Jehovah's Witnesses need in order to stay faithful. I mean, when I think of my idea of what the governing body was when I was a Jehovah's Witness, it was nothing like the governing body that we see on our screens in JW Broadcasting episodes or in the various other videos that they put out. I had this idea of kind of like a Jedi High Council of these Yoda-like figures who were just brimming with knowledge and wisdom and humility. They were all grandfatherly men who were very slow and ponderous and wise, and who, if I were to encounter one, perhaps on a visit to Bethel, and if I were to ask them a question, they would maybe pause, and they would then come out with something incredibly wise and profound. And what Jehovah's Witnesses are getting instead of that when they tune into JW Broadcasting is, "We warmly welcome you, dear brothers." They're getting clowns, quite frankly, in the form of people like Stephen Lett. They're getting drunken, rambling, incoherent buffoons in the form of Tony Morris. They're getting, in all other cases, just ordinary men who are nothing special and who speak in a very contrived, fake, synthetic way with almost no sincerity whatsoever. And it's got to damage the image that people have or like to have or need to have in their minds that they rely on in order to stay faithful. And I think the numbers are showing that. Obviously, for many witnesses, it's going to be something where they muscle through these JW Broadcasting episodes and they feel as though they have to like them. They feel as though they have to respect these men. But for anyone who has any kind of semblance of critical thinking skills still left in their minds, despite the indoctrination, it's going to grate. With each and every video they watch, they're going to realize, I'm being manipulated here. This is not logical reasoning. This is appealing to my emotions. These men are fake. They're relying on their auto cue. There's nothing sincere about what they're saying. There's nothing real. I'm just being manipulated. This is basically televangelism that I'm watching. That's going to be the realization of many. And again, I think we see that in the figures. But because the organization is so deluded, same as with the issue of child sexual abuse, same as with the issue of shunning, what you need when you're in my position as an apostate, as an opposer, what you need as your opposition is an organization that makes all the mistakes that you need them to make because they're deluded. And that's what we have in the governing body. They just keep shooting themselves in the foot because they honestly think that they are God's sole channel of communication and that any idea that comes out of their minds is fantastic and worth pursuing. Anyway, I've explained that factor sufficiently, hopefully. The next factor on my list is increased internet access. The internet is slowly becoming more available. And we see this at the moment with the rollout of the Starlink initiative by SpaceX. Thousands of satellites being released into orbit to basically make the internet more accessible, even in parts of the world where there wasn't previously infrastructure that would make the internet available. And it's not just Starlink, there's obvious incentives for companies and entrepreneurs to make the internet more available, because the more available the internet is, the more money there is to be made. People need the internet. And the more people have the internet in countries where the organization perhaps benefits from a lack of availability of information that goes against the organization's narrative, this can only have, again, a very corrosive impact on the organization. The more people are able to access objective analysis of the organization, information that's critical, information that debunks the organization's teachings and the organization's narrative, this is inevitably going to cause problems and conceivably be fatal to the organization's long-term goals. The internet is killing cults. And I think out of all of the factors on my list, arguably the availability of the internet is probably going to be the most decisive factor, because the Jehovah's Witness organization simply wasn't built to function in the 21st century. It was built to function in the 20th century when you could monopolize information. You could create your own books, and when you give someone a book, they think, oh, this must be legit because look, there's an actual book. They wouldn't have published a book on it if it wasn't a legit thing that they're talking about. That's no longer the way we take in information. We're not reliant on books anymore. We're not reliant on printed media anymore. Anyone, basically, can get access to information on almost anything now. And Jehovah's Witnesses weren't designed to operate in that environment. Jehovah's Witnesses, as an organization, need to have a total monopoly on information. It's part of the bite model, Stephen Hassan's bite model, if you think about it. Control people's behavior, control information, control thoughts, and control emotions. The information is a big one, though, because if you can control the information, you can control the narrative, and it's easier to deceive people. The more people have access to the internet around the world, in countries that previously didn't have internet access, where the organization has grown because of the lack of internet, this is going to be very harmful to the organization's long-term goals and aspirations. And the final point on my list is downsizing. Now, downsizing is kind of related to almost all of the factors I've already been considering, maybe arguably not JW Broadcasting. But downsizing is an inevitable consequence of an organization that is battling negative PR due to its shunning policy, due to its child sex abuse mishandling. Downsizing is inevitable for an organization that was built for the 20th century that is struggling in the 21st century because of the availability of the internet. But downsizing also is kind of its own runaway phenomenon. It's its own kind of snowball effect. Because what you have when you have downsizing for a religious organization that for decades is convincing its followers that it has God's blessing because, look, we're expanding in these countries. Look, we've just dedicated these new branch facilities. Look, we're building all these kingdom halls. What you then have is a problem because people will remember that narrative. They'll be used to that narrative of growth, of expansion. And then when they see the organization shrinking because of, in many cases, these factors I've already discussed, witnesses will think, hang on, maybe this organization doesn't have God's backing because, oh, look, my local Kingdom Hall has been sold and I'm having to travel an extra 30, 40 minutes just to get to a Kingdom Hall meeting twice a week. Or my local assembly hall has been shut down. Or my local branch has been consolidated with a neighboring country. You know, all of these things will be noticed by Jehovah's Witnesses. And though the organization may try to put a spin on things and say, oh, we're simplifying, this isn't downsizing. This is simplifying the work. This is making our organization more efficient. A more efficient use of dedicated funds. They can say all that if they like. But ultimately, with change after change after change, with retreat after retreat after retreat, what you end up with is a smaller organization. And at some point, people notice how small it is. At some point, people notice, there aren't as many congregations anymore. There aren't as many branches anymore. Our religion is smaller. How does that fit in with this narrative that I've been given since I was small, that Jehovah is blessing the organization, and therefore there will just be this continual expansion? Wondrous expansion is now taking place. Jehovah's hand can be seen in the way the organization is just ballooning in size and present in all these different lands. And when you see that the reality is different,
it's going to create some problems. It's going to be a catalyst for some severe cognitive dissonance that could spill over into full awakening. People realizing maybe this isn't the religion that I was sold, either when I was studying or when I was being indoctrinated as a child. Maybe it's blatantly obvious that this isn't Jehovah's organization. It's just another man-made organization that's struggling in the internet age because its teachings are unraveling under scrutiny. So I think those are my 5 biggest factors. And again, they're sort of interrelated. You can't just take one and say, this is independent of all the rest. And there are other factors as well. I could probably make a much longer video if I went into each and every factor that threatens the long-term prosperity of Jehovah's Witnesses. But if there is going to be a point where the organization goes bankrupt, or if there is going to be a point where the organization shrinks to a point where it's just completely unrecognizable from anything that Jehovah's Witnesses are used to, I think it's going to be one of those 5 things that is the final deciding factor in essentially killing the Jehovah's Witness organization, or at least rendering it unrecognizable from what it was. So I hope this video has been interesting for you, perhaps food for thought. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.